Hey, welcome to the Quotive Corner. Today's quote is a short one, 3 sentences, but don't let the length fool you. This one has layers, and the deeper you go, the more uncomfortable it gets, in a good way. It is not insult from another that causes you pain. It is the part of your mind that agrees with the insult. Agree only with the truth about you, and you are free. That's from Alan Cohen, an American author and life coach who has written over 24 books on spirituality, self-worth, and personal transformation. He's not a philosopher in the academic sense. He's a practitioner, someone who has spent decades thinking carefully about why people suffer and what actually releases them from it. This quote is very much in that tradition, and it's worth sitting with slowly because the first sentence alone could carry an entire episode. It is not insult from another that causes you pain. Listen to that again. Not the insult. The insult on its own is just words, sounds, someone else's opinion delivered toward you. It has no inherent power to wound, and yet, we've all felt the sting of one. Sometimes deeply, sometimes for days. So what's actually happening? Cohen's answer is in the second sentence. It is the part of your mind that agrees with the insult. That's the mechanism. The insult lands, and somewhere inside, maybe quickly, maybe quietly, something in you nods, recognizes it, says, yes, that might be true. And that internal agreement is where the pain actually lives, not in what was said, but in what you allowed to be confirmed. Think about that for a moment. If someone called you something completely untrue, something you had zero internal resonance with, you'd probably just find it absurd. It wouldn't stick. It wouldn't keep you up at night. But when an insult lands close to something you've already suspected about yourself, that's when it cuts. That's when it replays. Because the other person didn't create the wound. They found the one that was already there. This is a genuinely important distinction, and it's one that most people never make. We tend to locate the source of emotional pain externally. They said this, they did that, if only they hadn't. And there's a kind of comfort in that. It keeps the problem outside of you, which means you don't have to do anything uncomfortable on the inside. But it also keeps you powerless, because if the pain lives out there with them, your relief depends on them too. Cohen is pointing towards something much more liberating, even if it's harder to hear. The pain is yours, which means so is the key. That's the third sentence. Agree only with the truth about you, and you are free. Simple to say, genuinely hard to do. Because it requires 2 things that most of us find difficult in combination: knowing your own truth clearly enough to recognize when something doesn't belong there, and having enough self-trust to hold that line when someone pushes against it. We talked before about what Hoffer observed, that rudeness is the weak man's imitation of strength. He was looking at the person throwing the insult. Cohen is looking at the person receiving it. And what both observations have in common is that the real action is internal. The insult is external noise. What you do with it is where the work lives. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this framing, because it can be misread. Cohen is not saying that other people's cruelty doesn't matter, or that victims of abuse or harassment should simply work on their mindset. That would be a distortion of the idea. Words can be weaponized, patterns of behavior can cause real harm, and no amount of inner clarity makes sustained mistreatment acceptable. The quote isn't about excusing what others do. It's about understanding where your pain actually comes from, so you have access to it. There's also a version of this idea that can tip into toxic self-blame. If you are in pain, it doesn't always mean you agreed with something false about yourself. Sometimes pain is just pain. Grief, loss, disappointment. And it doesn't need a psychological explanation. Cohen's observation applies most specifically to the particular sting of personal insult, not to every variety of human suffering. But within that specific territory, he's onto something real. The most resilient people aren't the ones who've never been insulted. They're the ones who have built such a clear and honest relationship with their own self-image that external attacks don't find much to grip. Not because they're arrogant or dismissive, but because they've done the work of actually knowing themselves, their strengths, their flaws, their values, their genuine limitations, and they've made peace with that picture. So when someone tries to impose a different one, it doesn't stick. That's the freedom Cohen is describing. Not the freedom from ever being criticized, not immunity from other people's opinions, but the freedom that comes from not needing anyone else's assessment to confirm or deny your own. And honestly, that kind of freedom is rarer than it sounds. Most of us are running some level of background check on how others see us, adjusting, editing, managing impressions, which means we're also more vulnerable than we need to be to what those others say. So the real work the quote is pointing toward isn't defensive. It's not about building thicker skin or learning to not care. It's about getting genuinely honest with yourself, knowing what's true about you and what isn't, clearly enough that you can tell the difference when someone else weighs in. Agree with what's true. Let go of what isn't, and notice how much quieter it gets. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If this one nudged something loose, maybe a criticism that's been living rent-free longer than it should, sit with it and perhaps even share it. As usual, remember that wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. I'll catch you in the next one.